Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? So this is something I've done a lot of thinking about recently. Um, and I've made YouTube videos about this before a few months ago, right? How the way that humans and other living things form, right, points to an evolutionary origin, right? We grow in the womb of a mother, we need support from the mother's body, right, in order to grow, right? Um, we never see a full, adult human form without growing from, originally being a baby and originally growing from a single cell. Every one of us grew from a single cell. There's no alternative way known for a human to form, right? And the single cell zygote that you start out as, right, it cannot grow on its own into the form that you have at birth, right? It needs support from various features of the mother's body, right? Which themselves form through these same processes, right? Likewise, with certain other groups, right? A chicken, right? It grows from a single celled zygote, right? And that zygote will not just on its own grow into the form it has when it hatches. It needs various features of the egg, right? Which are produced by the mother's body, right? And so, creationists, right, will sometimes misrepresent, like the homologies that we see amongst living things and how that is evidence towards evolution. And they will be like, oh, they're just, disregarding the possibility of it just as well could be common design as opposed to common ancestor. But there's a few big points they're missing. For one thing, we're not just haphazardly noticing like commonalities between different groups, like, oh, birds fly and bats fly and insects fly. It's not like that. We observe nested hierarchical patterns that groups of living things are organized into, right? Mammals, tetrapods, vertebrates, right? We see these nested hierarchical patterns with very impressive predictive accuracy, right? And often in ways that are very odd, right? Without the context of understanding that it's inherited via common descent, right? Like, to give a good example, why is it that you have exactly 7 vertebrae in your neck? That is because you are a mammal, right? That would not be the case if you were not a mammal, right? But that applies to almost all mammals out of thousands. Even giraffes, which have such a long neck, even they have exactly 7 vertebrae in their neck, just like me and you. It's much more long and stretched out in them, but the number is exactly 7. Also camels and llamas, they also have very long necks, but again, 7 vertebrae in their neck, right? And also creatures with more short necks that are mammals, like mice, again, 7 vertebrae in their neck, right? Whereas this does not apply to birds, reptiles, and amphibians, right? Because they are not mammals, it doesn't apply to them, right? So it isn't just like predicted based on like, oh, all living things have this. No, specifically mammals do, right? And I mean, there's so many things you could predict about our body just based on the fact that we're mammals. The fact that we have 3 middle ear bones, right? Again, that applies to all mammals, right? And it does not apply to birds, reptiles, amphibians. They all have one bone in their middle ear, right? The fact that you have one lower jawbone, right? The fact that you have a diaphragm, epiglottis, neocortex, four-chambered heart, hair, sweat glands, mammary glands, sebaceous glands, um, the fact that if we're talking specifically theory in mammals, I could talk about the fact that you have the external protruding ear cartilage, right, the pinna, right, and the fact that you have a philtrum, the little indentation between your nose and mouth, right. The fact that you were born live, right? Which connects to the topic of this video, right? There's so much you could predict just based on the fact that you're a mammal. Same with tetrapods. Same with the fact that you're a catarrhine primate. So we find groups nested within groups, nested within groups. So it's not just a haphazard, like, oh, this thing and this thing both fly or whatever. We see nested hierarchical patterns with very odd predictability, right, with things like I said of the 7 vertebrae in the neck, right, which doesn't apply to other groups. So it isn't just like across the board applying to all, it's specifically applying to members of a group, right, which you could predict just based on one feature that something is a part of the group, right, like if it has hair. Based on that, we know it's a mammal, and then just based on that, we can therefore predict that all of these other things will also be true of its anatomy, whereas we would not predict that otherwise, right? But in any event, further hammering home, though, why evolutionary processes, right, give us by far the greatest explanation to these phenomenon, to what we observe, right, with the nested hierarchical patterns, right. We see, right, that an adult human, an adult chicken, you know for many organisms, right, you cannot just start out like with an adult body like this. You grow from a single cell, right? Um, and that cell depends on features of the mother's body, or in the case of chicken, produces, relies at first on features of the mother's body and eventually, relies on things that the mother's body produces, right? Um, and it would be much more, expensive, a lot more work, a lot more labor towards, if you were to like, oh, we're going to make, not to mention that it's never been done, right? And but it would be much more expense, much more labor to, we're gonna make a machine like by hand manually that does what the mother's body does, right, like an artificial womb, right. And further hammering that home, right, consider, right, that while amongst placental mammals, right, we see overall mostly the same reproductive setup. Obviously a lot of differences between groups, but in fundamental ways, obviously much more commonality than like with a bird's reproductive method, for example, right. um but the reproductive system of like a mouse will not work for example, a blue whale, right? A blue whale has a much larger womb, right? And so think about how expensive it would be if you were to build by like manually build some giant machine that like could be an artificial womb for like a blue whale and an elephant, all of these, giant creatures, all of these different sizes, build it, individually. Think about how expensive that would be, how much labor that would be, right? Whereas it's much simpler through means of common descent, right? Because you see, even in the case of the blue whale, all of its reproductive anatomy grew from a single cell, right? Even though it's so big, it all grew from a single cell, right? And that cell contained many identical genetic instructions for the building of the reproductive anatomy, as are seen in humans, bats, mice, etc., right? And genetic instructions which self copy constantly, right? Um, and so rather than, having to build some type of like machine manually, right? You could just have the blue whales progress back to earlier creatures, gradually progressing back to smaller and smaller creatures. Further supporting that, we do see that the fin whale, which the blue whale can interbreed with, they are smaller, right? And yet still capable of interbreeding, even though they are not as big as the blue whale. Obviously, they couldn't breed with something as small as a mouse, but they can interbreed with the blue whale. And we find that there's a large group of whales, many whales of varying sizes, many varying sizes of whales, right? Um, and you have some, dolphins technically are whales, so you have some as small as that, right? And you have, plenty in between, right? Lots of uh varying sizes of whales, right? And so rather than having to, put in all of the expense, the labor in, you know, constructing some type of machine, which by the way never actually has been made, right, to, grow like a blue whale without a mother, right? You could just have the reproductive anatomy of its mother, right, be how the first of them grew and developed, and that reproductive anatomy itself grew from a single cell and was inherited from earlier ancestors, and ultimately, and same for all the different placental mammals of varying sizes, ultimately all tracing back to one ancestral species, right? And but of course, while that explains, that helps from the standpoint of like the blue whale is larger versus, mouse is smaller, horse is another size, and yet they all share, commonalities of their reproductive anatomy, right? Um, it's still, while it narrows all of that down, what it still leaves us with the question then is, well, the first placental mammals, how did they form if their parents did not have the features of these anatomy? But evolutionary theory also gives us the best explanation for that as well, right? Because we see, right, that there are other reproductive systems that work just fine for other groups. We also see that our reproductive system is part of the nested hierarchical organization, right? There's traits of the placental reproductive system, Therians, which is a group we're a part of, there's traits of that reproductive system, mammals, amniotes. We see that it's all part of the nested hierarchical organization of life, and we see that there are other reproductive methods that work just fine for other groups of animals. Now, mind you, they would not work for us, right, because of our current system. But you got to remember, right, evolutionary theory allows that our ancestors have changed over time. Their body has not always been the same as it is now, that they have changed, right? And so the dependency on our current reproductive system can itself be acquired through evolution after that reproductive system is in place, eventually leading back to creatures which had this reproductive system but did not depend on it to the extent that we do, and then eventually back to creatures with differing reproductive systems, right? So before placental mammals, eventually back to creatures likely having a reproductive system more like the marsupials, right? So shorter gestation, no umbilical cord, likely having pouches, right? And then back to common ancestry with the marsupials. Then before that, in the ancestors of all therians, right, live birth is evolved, right, and the placenta is evolved, right, eventually then tracing back to creatures which laid amniotic eggs, like we see still done in the monotremes and the reptiles, right, reptiles including birds, right, because birds actually technically are reptiles, right. And then back to common ancestry with those groups. Then in the ancestors of all amniotes, right, we have the evolution. Well, for one thing, to give you guys an idea of like why we began having dependency on amniotic eggs and internal fertilization, amniotes lost the gills that our ancestors originally had, although we still do during embryonic development form the pharyngeal arches and slits, which originally in our ancestry developed into gills, and in fish still do develop into gills, right? The same embryonic structures, right? And with much of the same genetic instructions still for making these embryonic structures, right? But no longer developing into gills. The gills were lost, right? Because our ancestors no longer depended on them. Also, at this time, our ancestors were cold-blooded, which the evolution of being warm-blooded actually came when our ancestors still had, when they still laid eggs, because even the monotremes, platypus and echidna, are warm-blooded. But at this time, our ancestors were cold-blooded. They had gills. They had a different setup where they did not have dependency on amniotic eggs or internal fertilization, and eventually progressed back to reproductive methods more like that of amphibians and fish, where they had non-amniotic eggs and fertilized externally, right? And then taking it even much, much further back, right? The various setups like the circulatory system, the respiratory system, these were first evolved, and the dependency on them was evolved, eventually tracing back to creatures which did not have circulatory system nor respiratory system, nor needed those for survival, which we still see in some creatures alive today, like flatworms, jellyfish, and comb jellies, and sponges, right? And because of having this simpler setup with no respiratory system, no circulatory system, they did not have dependency on even laying eggs for birth. They didn't have dependency on eggs to begin with. They were able to lay eggs, mind you, but they did not have dependency on that. They could reproduce through methods that we still see done in flatworms, jellyfish, comb jellies, and sponges, where one method is called budding, where the offspring grows on top of the parent and then eventually breaks off. Another method is fission, where they break into two pieces, each which grows into a full new organism. And another is called fragmentation, where they divide into multiple pieces, each which develops into a full organism. All of that is still done by flatworms, jellyfish, comb jellies, and sponges, right? And so back in earlier times when our ancestors had not yet evolved their circulatory system, their respiratory system, and they did not have dependency on those systems, they therefore did not have dependency on even any parts of the egg. They could reproduce through methods such as budding, fission, fragmentation, although they still did lay eggs, mind you. And interestingly, even the reproductive anatomy, which produces the eggs and the sperm can itself be produced through those reproductive methods, right? So when they reproduce through budding, fission, fragmentation, the reproductive organs which produce sperm and egg, those organs themselves are grown through those methods, right? So that all the more, reduces down the origin, right, of these systems, right? And in early animals, we have the evolution of the first specialized sex organs, right? Eventually back to creatures that had male and female and sperm and egg, but no actual sex organs like we still see in sponges, right? And then in the ancestors of all animals, after evolving multicellularity, they evolved male and female and sperm and egg, eventually leading back to single-celled organisms which reproduce both sexually and asexually through the types of methods that we see in some single-celled organisms still alive today, right? And similarly, we can break it down, for other groups that have evolved multicellularity, like plants, fungi, and ultimately all the groups of organisms, right, have replicated through the mechanism shared by all life on Earth for replication. Ultimately, all life on Earth tracing back to one single common ancestor species, right? And also, even down at the cellular level, common descent gives us the best explanation, right? Because it is far more easier to make a living organism from already existing organisms than from scratch, right? You may have heard, right, that synthetic life has been made in the labs, but that was only using already existing cells, right? No one has ever successfully in the laboratory made a living cell from scratch. They always needed pre-existing organisms, right? And so this supports the notion then that all of the groups of organisms must have been created by earlier organisms, right? Not to mention that we observe these nested hierarchical patterns which go all the way down to the molecular level, the cellular level, all the way down at that level. There's nested hierarchical patterns of the molecular instructions which self-replicate themselves, right? And furthermore, if you were to have any objections like, this method of doing it, it might have too many steps, or it might take too much time, that only would call into question why this method of how living things make more of themselves would be the chosen method of making us to begin with then, right? Because there will be alternative methods, right? If there could be a God that, has the intelligence of all of the billions of humans collected over thousands of years, which it would need to in order to be able to do all of this, if there could be such a thing and that could itself have higher odds of existing by chance with no origin of its own, like if that could have higher odds than the first life existing, right, which would be necessary for us to consider that as a possibility, right, then why not and that thing could make living organisms, why not that thing make self-replicating robots, right, that build things more so in the type of way that a human builds things like planes, whatever, right, builds whatever machines, and these robots could make, they can make more self-replicating robots which build things in that type of way. And then if you were to do it that way, right, you would not have any issue of, you could have less amount of steps, quicker amount of time, right? And so if you were to have an objection like that, that would ultimately just come back to why would the system be made that way to begin with when it wouldn't have to be, right? You can make a robot, right, that walks around, does various things without it growing from a cell, right? And So, all right, that's all for now. See you guys.